So CSS Grid is a set of CSS properties for building two-dimensional layouts. In Flexbox, we say we use Flexbox to build one-dimensional layout. And here is a perfect example of a two-dimensional layout. So you can actually see create different layouts, countless rows and columns, right? It doesn't matter the number of rows and columns that you have in a particular layout. So the main idea behind CSS Grid is that we divide a container element into rows and columns that can be filled with its child element. So in two-dimensional layout context, CSS Grid allows us to write less nested HTML and easier to read CSS. Unlike Flexbox, in Flexbox there are some layouts whereby you have to write a lot of nested CSS for you to be able to achieve the Flexbox properties. But in CSS Grid, you write less nested HTML and easier to read CSS. So CSS Grid is not meant to replace Flexbox. Instead, they work perfectly together. So if you need a one-dimensional layout, you go for Flexbox. So here is a one-dimensional layout. But if you need two-dimensional layout, you use the CSS Grid. All right. So CSS Grid is not meant to replace Flexbox. You can actually use them together. And I believe after this session, you're going to know how to use both Flexbox and CSS Grid together, which will kind of make you powerful when you are creating a complex layout. All right, so let's look at this basic CSS Grid terminology. Now, as usual, we have the container and then the child or the items. So we have this big container, right? And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes, which are the items. So the container is the grid container, all right? And then the boxes here are the grid items. And to make a container a grid, we use the display property again. Remember, in the Flexbox, we use display property. By setting display property to flex, we can use it to make an element a flex container. So similarly in grid, you use the display property and then set it to grid to make that element a grid container. And then once you do that, automatically all the direct child elements will become the grid items. All right. Unlike Flexbox, remember Flexbox, we have two main axes, the main axis and the cross axis in Flexbox. And the main axis direction can actually change, right? But in grid, you have two axes, the column axis and the row axis. So nothing can actually change this axis, which kind of make our grid a bit simpler. All right, so the direction of row cannot change. Row remain rows and then columns remain columns. All right, so that's the whole idea. All right, so let's proceed. Now we have the grid lines. Okay, grid lines, and grid lines is divided into two: the grid line rows and grid line columns. So these are the grid lines. Just consider this dotted portion, right? These dotted borders, they are the grid lines. And how do you calculate a grid line? A grid line is calculated, or for instance, the grid line row is calculated by adding 1 to the total number of rows. For instance, look at this grid or this box. This box has 2 rows, right? Row 1 and then row 2. So which means the grid line row is 3. So the number of rows plus 1, that's 3. And how do you count it? This is the first one, the first grid line row. Okay, the second grid line row, and then the third grid line row. So similarly, if you want to calculate grid line columns, the number of columns plus 1. Here we have three columns, right? 1, 2, 3 columns, then plus 1, that's 4. So which means the grid line columns is 4. So this is the first grid line column, 1, the second one, okay, the third one, and then the fourth one. So that's that for grid line. Then we have the track. Okay, so we have the grid track column and the grid track row as well. So this is the track for this first column here. Okay, this is a track, this is another track, this is another track. Then for row, we have the grid track row and then grid track row. Please, what you should even pay more attention to right now, in fact, pay attention to all this terminology. But you see these grid line rows, you are going to use it a lot, especially if you want to span or a particular grid item. Okay, we want to span it 2 times, 3 times. With the knowledge of grid lines, you'll be able to do that seamlessly. All right, then we have the gaps. Okay, gaps which we can use to create or maybe margin or space or gap between the grid items. All right, and then we have the grid cell. So a single box, the portion for the box, you can consider it as a cell. So this is a grid cell, another grid cell, another grid cell, another grid cell, another one, and then another grid cell right here. So that's that. For I think at this point we are good to start writing our grid. So we have properties that we can set on grid container and grid items. Remember, the parent element is the container, and then the direct child, after you have made that parent a grid container, right? All the direct child becomes the grid items. So all those properties there are they only apply to the grid container. Then likewise here, these two properties, they can only take effect on grid items. So quickly look at the first one here. We have the grid template rows and grid template columns, right? So we use this to determine the size of the track. Now, so you now see how we are now using this terminology. We talk about track. Here is a track, grid track row. That's correct. Grid track roll, grid track roll. So we have 2 tracks, right? And then for columns, we have 3 tracks, right? The first track, second track, and then the third track. So we use the grid track, yes. Let me take it back to the properties. Grid template rows, okay, to set the size of each track along the row axis, and then we use the grid template columns to set the size of each track along the column axis. So to establish the grid row and column tracks, 1 length unit for each track. Any unit can be used. So you can use pixels, you can use percentages, you can use rem, you can use, in fact, there's a new one which is the FR. Don't worry, I'm going to show us how to use FR. So you can use this FR, which is a flexible unit, or you can call it fraction. All right, to fill the unused space. All right. So grid template rows and grid template columns. Again, to establish the tracks, okay, for rows and columns. So let's see. I have prepared the document for this particular session. So let's start from the index.html. So here is the simple markup that we have. If you look at the body, we have just one section, one parent element, one element section with a class name of container, right? And then it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 direct child elements, each with 2 classes, right? Two class names. Box 1, second one, box 2, box 3, box 4, box 5, box 6 for the last element. Then I have embedded the external style sheet right in this HTML document. And if I head straight to the style.css, you can see this is where I reset the default browser styles by using the universal selector. Then I use the sudo before class and the after class, and then the before element and after element, and then I set the margin to 0. If you have any margin on any element, any default margin set to 0. Similarly, padding to 0, and then the box sizing so that we can specify the exact width, or the exact width that we specify on an element should be the exact width of the total box. All right, and then we have the HTML here, which is the root element, because I use rem somewhere around here, so which means this will enable me to calculate this by 10. So we have actually covered this in our previous session. In case if you still do not understand, you can look it up on the playlist. All right, then the container. Remember, we have this section with the class of container, right? And basically we have a very simple and basic style. So the background color set to black, and if you look at the output, here is the section with the class of container, and then set the height to 80% of the viewport height. So 80%. So which means the white space here is 20% to complete 100% of our viewport. All right. So 80% of the viewport height, and then box. Now back to index.html. All the divs elements here, they have common class name, which is box. So which means what I'm doing here is that all the divs there, all the divs should have the same font size of 1.6 rem, which is also equivalent to 16 pixels. All right. And then I actually gave individual item there, their background color. So the box one has green, second one has peru, like that, down to the 6 elements which has orange, and you can see the output right here. Box 1, box 2, box 3, 4, 5, and 6. So let's jump straight to grid. So back to the slide again. To make an element a grid container, remember you set the display property to grid. Display property to grid. All right, the display property to grid. Now, what I'm going to do is I will identify the elements that I actually want to, or that I actually want as my grid container. Back to the index.html. I actually want this section with the class of container to be the grid container. All right. So to my CSS, so here is the element here, right? The element. So I can just create a comment, grid, display to grid, display property to grid. Now look at what's going to happen to our design. If I refresh now, you see they all stretch. They stretch to take equal size. Okay, equal size, and then they occupy the entire height of the parent element. Anyways, you're going to see the reason why shortly. Let me show us what is going on right here. Back to the properties. If you look at align items, okay, now we have justify items, align items. I believe, or you have seen this in Flexbox. So we also have align items in Flexbox. All right. But then the main axis and the cross axis, which we have in Flexbox, it does not apply to grid here. Main axis and cross axis can actually change in direction. But right here, the justify items, anywhere you see justify, just know that it goes along the roll axis, and then align items or align content goes along the vertical axis or the column axis. All right. So now if we take a look at the design again, this is the vertical axis, right? Vertical axis. So which means the elements or the grid items, they stretch to occupy the exact height of the parent element. And why is that happening? As a result of those align items whose default value is stretch. So they stretch. Similarly for the justified items, they will stretch, all right, to take the full width of the parent element or of the grid container. All right, so now let's now use the grid template rows. Again, we use grid template rows to set the size of each track. Now let's say we actually want 3 tracks, 3 rows, or 3 grid tracks that's along the row axis, right? All we need to do is we go back to our code and then say grid template dash rows. Okay, rows. So if I need 3 tracks along the row axis, right? So all I need to do is to say, if I say 200 pixels, 150 pixels, and maybe 200 pixels again, right? If I say, let's say 100 here, say I want 100 here, save this, and head back to the browser, and then refresh. Look at what just happened now. We have successfully set 3 size, okay, for the grid track row. Track 1 for the row, track 2 for the row, and then track 3 for the row. And because we have other elements or other grid items, which are the box 4, box 5, box 6, right? They have to squeeze themselves into the remaining space that we have in the grid container. Anyways, let's create grid template columns. Let's say tracks for or maybe three columns. So it's going to be grid template column. I want the first one to have 150, second one 180, third one 200. Save. So look at what just happened right now. So we have set three grid track columns and 2 grid track rows. All right, 3 grid track columns and 2 grid track row. Now let me explain what is happening right now. Let's start from, I'm going to take this to the top. All right, so let's start with the grid template columns. We set 3 values, right? 150 pixels, 180 pixels, and 200 pixels. So basically what is happening here is that 150 pixels, right, determine the size of the first column that we have in our design, this first one. So which means the width from here to here is 150 pixels. Now if I increase the value, for instance, to let's say 350 for the first track, along the column axis, the vertical axis, right? If I refresh, you see it has increased in width. It has increased in width for this particular column. Similarly, if I increase the value of the last grid track column here to, let's say, 300, save, it's going to increase as well in width. You can see that basically. So these are you specify the size of each track. Then let's try the first row. For the first row, we have 200. So let's increase it to 250. So the height is going to increase this time around. So you see the height has increased for the first grid track row. And then maybe we should try this as well. 150 pixels. Okay, I don't know if that's increased, but okay, yes, we have 3 rows actually, but we don't have enough items, right? We don't have enough items to occupy the last row. I can see this is the last row here, right? This is the last row, but we don't have enough item. So that we are not going to confuse ourselves, just going to take it to 2. So let's see what's going to happen now. Yeah, great. So now what I'm going to do is I will increase. I'm going to add 50 to it to make it 200, and then if I refresh, see it has increased in size. That is the height of that grid track row. So that's that for grid template columns and grid template row. Then next up, I think we have the gap. But then before we proceed, okay, let's look at gap, because I was going to show us other units. Because for the grid track columns and grid template rows and grid template columns, you can use any unit that you want. You can use 350 rem, 180 percentage. You can use FR. All right, don't worry, I'm going to show us how to use that shortly. So back to the template you're using. So we have the gap. Okay. So one good thing about grid is that you can specify the gap either along the vertical axis or the horizontal axis. As you can see, we have the row gap, we have the column gap, and of course, we also have the shorthand property, which is gap. So if you're using this shorthand property, it's going to affect both the row and column. So let's see that first. So let's use the shorthand property. I'm going to use the shorthand property first. Anyways, let's look at our design. Look at the design. Each of the items that we have here, there is no space. As you can see, they are all together basically. So the same container, same grid container, I'm going to say gap of 24 pixels. So 24 pixels gap. Refresh. Look at it. So we've created gaps along the vertical axis, similarly along the horizontal axis. All right. So I'm going to comment it out. So we have gap now, gap. Okay, good, because I've commented it. So if you actually want the gap to affect the horizontal axis alone, so all you need to do is to specify the row gap property and say maybe 12 pixels. 12 pixels. So you see, we already have gap along the horizontal axis. And if you want the, horizontal, that's correct, I'm correct. So if you now want the horizontal axis, gap along the horizontal axis, vertical axis, just sorry, I've been making the mistake. So if you want gap along the vertical axis now, so I believe you know what to do. So guess right. You can say, okay, you want 2 pixels for the column axis. Right, so that's how we can use gap basically. So I'm going to comment it out again. Great. So let's look at the next one that we have there. Let's refresh this first. Great. So we have justify items and align items. So justify items and align items to align items inside rows and columns, that is horizontally and vertically. So, and I have explained that justify items actually function along the horizontal axis, while align items functions along the vertical axis, and they have the same values actually. Stretch, center, stretch, start, center, and end. In Flexbox, we have something like flex start, flex end, right? But in Grid, we really have start, center, end. So you have to be very careful actually. And that's why it is very important that you work on projects. It doesn't have to be a big project. Just keep it simple and get used to all these properties so that you won't mix them up. So stretch, start, center, end. Same thing for align items. So let's now see how to use it. To actually see how this works, basically, I'm going to open up my developer tool. So I can just right click, then inspect. I will open up my developer tool. So I've opened up this developer tool, right? Now look at the element here. You know, we have the section which has the 6 divs elements. Then at the front of this section, you're going to see this tag here, or this badge. It says what? Grid. So the browser could identify that this element is a grid, right? Or a container grid. If you click on that grid, look at what just happened now. So browser actually gives us more information about that grid. We talked about grid line the other time, right? So grid line rows and grid line columns. If you look at these grid lines, we have this is the first one, grid line 1 for columns, grid line 2, grid line 3, and then grid line 4. Then for the row, grid line 1, grid line 2, grid line 3, right? Then this -4 here is actually because it is counting from behind. -1, -2, -3, and then -4. Similarly, -1 along the row axis, like -2, and then -3, basically. All right. I actually opened this up so that we can see how justify items and align items actually work in CSS Grid. So again, justify items works along the horizontal axis, yes, horizontal axis, while align items is along the vertical axis. And the default value of both properties is stretch. So along the horizontal axis, it now makes sense that the grid items, right, actually stretch to occupy the entire grid cell. Remember, a cell, this is a cell, this green portion is a cell, this pale color here is a cell, this another cell, another cell, another cell, then another cell, basically. So let's take a look at justify items first. Justify items. So justify items. Stretch is the default, so it's not going to change anything. Actually, if I refresh, it doesn't change anything. Then we have start. Justify items start. So basically, what this is going to do is that it's going to shrink the element, all right, to occupy the exact width of the content, and then to start at the beginning of each cell. So you see, the items now, they have shrink to take the exact width of their content, and then they begin at the very start of their grid cell. All right, so if I set it to center, guess right, to push it to the center of each grid cell. So grid items, center, so horizontally, right? Horizontally. Then end, we push it to the end. Justify items end. We push them to the end, basically. So that's that for justify items. So I'm going to comment it so that we can take it back. Remember, default is stretch, so which means since I've commented all the properties, so it's going to stretch. That is, to fall back to the default value. That makes sense. So items, again, it is stretch, but it's along the vertical axis. So let's see, align items. Align items. Stretch, save. So it's not going to change anything at this point because stretch is the default, and we can see the output right on the design already. So line items is start. So start with shrink and then push the item to the top, okay, to the top of each grid cell. Great. Vertically, right? Then center, we bring it to the center vertically. Save. Refresh to the center, then end, push it to the bottom. That's it. Next up, I'm going to comment it again, comment all the values here. Comment, take it back to, the default. Next one, we have the justify content and align content. So the difference is that now for justify content and align content, to align entire grid inside grid container. So only applies if container is larger than the grid. And obviously in our design, our container is larger than our grid. Our container is this dark portion, this black background here is our container, and this is our grid, right? So which means the container is larger than our grid, which means that we can actually use justify content and align content. So for justify content, if I justify content, default value is start. Oh, yeah, great. So the default is start. Similarly for align content, it starts, and then we have center, and then we have end. So what this means that if I set justify content to center, it will push the entire grid to the center of the grid container, okay, horizontally, and then end, we push to the end. And for align content, starts, okay, starting at the top. So if I say center, it will push to the center vertically, and then end, we push to the bottom. So let's see that. Justify content. Then start is the default, which is already at the start, okay, horizontally to the left. So I want to take it to the center, the entire grid. Justify content center. Refresh. So it has, you see, it has pushed it to the center, and then justify content end. Push it to the extreme end horizontally. So we can comment this, and then let's go for align content start. So it will push it back and then start remain at the top, right? Great. Then center vertically, that's going to be the video. of align content. Save, then we push it to the bottom. Align contents, and great. So that's that. So quickly, we're almost done. Let's look at now before we look at grid column and grid row, let's look at justify self and justify align self. Justify self and align self. So they actually have the same value as the properties that we can set on the grid container. Justify items and justify self. So difference is that override justify self and align self for single items. This applies to only what a single item in our grid container. So we can use justify self on a grid item. Let's take a look at our design first. Okay, I'd like to comment. Let's comment this out. Great. And then next thing I'm going to do is refresh to take it back to the default. Push to the top. Great. Now I want this box one. Okay, I would like to justify it okay to the start. So which means applying to this to target that element, which is box one, right? I will say justify self start, because default is stretch. The default is stretch actually. So start, if I refresh now, it will shrink. Then start at the beginning of the grid cell. So if I want to align this to the center vertically, right? So that's box 3. I'm going to identify that element in my CSS. So and see what align cell center. So center vertically, right? We shrink the items and then bring to the center vertically. Exactly. And if I actually want to make this center, keep it at the center, yes, horizontally, that's going to justify self center as box 5, right? Box 5. Justify self center. So box 5 now should shrink and keep it at the center horizontally. Great. If I actually want this to be horizontally aligned to the center and vertically aligned to the center, that's box 4. All I need to do is to say what? Align cell center, justify cell center. So box 4, refresh. Great. We have this. Yeah, because we actually set both align self and justify self to center. Very simple. So that's that. So finally, let's now look at the last 2 properties. So this grid column and grid row. So to place a grid item to a specific cell based on the line numbers. So this is where your grid lines knowledge come in play actually. So based on based on line numbers, right? So span keyword can be used to span an item across more cells. But anyways, let's see how we can use our grid lines to place item, on any grid cell that we want. Now, for instance, okay, first thing I'm going to do is I would like to comment on this align self and justify self properties so that we can work on those grid lines. I think that's all. Okay, save. So everything should be back to stretch. Nice. Now, for instance, if I want this box to to occupy the space for box 3 as well. So it's going to occupy a space together with the space required for box 3, right? I can actually set the grid line columns to 2/4. 2/4. So which means that I'm saying that this box 2 should actually start from where these two grid lines start and then where our 4 ends, basically. So box 2, look at what's going to happen now. Box 2, yes, box 2, grid. So it's going to be grid column actually because it's along the vertical axis, right? Let's take it back. So this is vertical axis. So it's going to be grid column, and the value is going to be 2/4, which means start on grid line column 2 and end at grid line column 4. That's the meaning of this value here. So if I take it back and refresh, look at it. So box 2 has been able to occupy its position and the one that was required for box 3. And then look at it, box 3 actually went down, and then which kind of forced the other grid item to adjust accordingly. All right, now let's see box 1, or let's use the grid line rows this time around. So I want box 1, which is this green box here, to occupy its space, similarly with the space that we have for box 3. So vertically this time around, right? So which means you have to target the grid row, the grid line rows. So it's going to be 1, 2, and 3, right? 1/3, because it's going to start here and then end here. So green has box 1, and then it's going to be grid row, grid dash row, okay? And I will set the value to 1/3. Save, back to the browser and refresh. So look at it here, box 3 has been able to stretch to occupy the available space that we have from grid line row 1 down to grid line row 3. All right, so this is how you can play around with the value. The only thing just to do is to figure out the grid line and then you set the value. Figure out the start of the grid line and the end of the grid line where you want a particular box to occupy, and then you set the value accordingly. All right, this should be all, but then I actually want to show us how you can use other units, okay, on the grid template rows and grid template columns. So for that reason, I'm going to comment out this as well. Comment this. Don't worry, we're going to work on some real life example or real world examples to give us a better understanding. So this is just a demo to explain how it works basically. So I've commented everything here. Okay, great. So I'll just close up my developer too so I can see everything in full. So now we use this pixels unit the other time, right? So I'm going to comment it out. I use other units like the FR. I'm going to refresh. Okay, so it's back to normal right now because we haven't specified the sizes for the grid track rows and grid track columns, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do right now is to say grid template column. Okay, I will say 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So FR is another unit, or we can call it fraction or flexible unit. So one fraction, one fraction, one fraction. What this means is that it's going to fill up the unused space that we have. Now, initially, when we had this first one, right, we save this. So pixels, refresh. Now, with the use of pixels, right, we're able to have unused space, which is this dark portion here, right? But with FR, we ensure that it takes the available space and then share it equally or share it based on the value that you have. So for instance, if you are using 1FR or two like this, right? 1FR, 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 it means that we're going to have equal size for the 3 grid track columns. All right, so I'm going to comment this back. Okay, let's make sure we are back to normal. This, okay, great. And I'm going to uncomment the fraction unit. So 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So which means I'm setting 3 tracks along the vertical axis, and then they are taking equal fraction. So back, refresh. So look at it, we don't have any unused space in our grid container anymore because of the FR unit that we use. Then another thing is that if I actually make this to 2FR, I made the second track along the vertical axis 2 times the first and the last track. So which means that this is going to increase. It will double up the sizes that we have on the first track and the last track. So let's take a look at it. If I refresh, you can see it's wider than the first track and the last track. So that's just the idea. The more you increase the value, the more space it actually occupy on the grid container. All right, I'll take it back to 1FR. Refresh. All right, and then for the grid template rows, you can actually set one. I use one FR as well. FR. So obviously, it's going to occupy the space vertically. So which we have already. So this is how we can use the fraction unit.